paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Armin Krishnan. Armin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. And you?
I'm doing good. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm an associate professor and director of security studies at East Carolina University. I'm actually from Germany. I did my master's degree in political science, and I did my PhD in the UK. And since 2009, I'm based in the United States. And I teach security studies, international security, intelligence, and foreign policy.
I came across a book of yours called Military Neuroscience and the Coming Age of Neurowarfare. And I was very impressed by the research. And could you give us a little background about your book?
Oh, thank you very much for that criticism. So I actually started working on the book in 2013, and it was published in 2016. So that is already some time back. So I got interested in the topic because of some earlier research that I did on autonomous weapon systems. And there was the idea of using the human brain for operating weapon systems. So that is brain-computer interfaces. And that led me ultimately to military neuroscience and neurowarfare. So it's already some time back that I was working on that book.
In your book, you said you were greatly influenced by John Mark's book, In Search of the Manchurian Candidate. And I've been greatly influenced by that book. It gives us an insight into mind control that we otherwise wouldn't have. How did that open up your perception to write this kind of a book?
Yeah, I have been interested in psychological warfare for some time and propaganda. And obviously, MKUltra is hugely important for understanding some of the history of psychological warfare and the applications, how it was used. So it took. I like that book very well because it does give us some idea what the CIA did during that period from 1949 to the early 1970s. And yeah, it is about psychological warfare.
What got you interested in neuroscience and neuroweapons?
Okay, it came out of some research that I did earlier on autonomous weapons. And there was a discussion about the possibility of having weapons that are controlled by the mind, so brain-computer interfaces. And that got me very interested in it. And then I did some other research on targeted killings. And actually, I wrote a book in Germany about it that included the possibility of using directed energy weapons for secret assassinations. And that kind of touched a nerve with a couple of people. So I got some mail, emails, and also physical mail from people who claimed that they were targeted individuals. And that really got me interested about whether this was a real thing or not. And yeah, I wanted to research military neuroscience applications. And I also came across MKUltra, which is about the development of psychological warfare methods and tools. And that goes back to the Cold War era. And I don't think that this kind of research ever stopped, and it remains quite relevant to the present day.
I was influenced by John Marks in Search of the Manchurian Candidate, like you were, and he thinks that that research has stopped in the early 1970s when our government said it stopped. But I'm not as optimistic as he is. And you define neurowarfare in a couple of different ways. You use neuroscientists James Giordano and Rachel Wurzman's definition, and that is the objectives of neuroweapons in a traditional defense context may be achieved by altering functions of the nervous system so as to affect cognitive, emotional, and or motor activity and capability. Many technologies, such as neurotropic drugs and interventional neurostimulatory devices, can be employed to produce these effects. And then later in the book, you kind of give us your definition. In view of these difficulties, because there's different definitions of neurowarfare, it is argued here, for the sake of simplicity, that neuroweapons are weapons that specifically target the brain or the central nervous system in order to affect the targeted person's mental state, mental capacity, and ultimately the person's behavior in a specific and predictable way. Would you like to expand upon that?
Very simply speaking, neurowarfare is the use of neuroweapons in the context of an armed conflict or some strategic competition. So neuroweapons are any kind of methods or mechanisms that can be used for monitoring or altering mental states, mental capacity, perception, and behavior. And yeah, there are different approaches of how that could be accomplished. So you can use biological or chemical agents for doing that, and also directed energy weapons. And also you can use information, and that also connects to cyber warfare and modern day of information operations.
You started out with looking at the CIA's mind control program, and you pulled out a 1952 CIA memorandum that gives an objective to their mind control. Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation? So that's quite a target to shoot for. And
yeah, that was the time when they were trying to develop a Manchurian candidate.
yes.
So they were working with hypnosis in order to see whether they can have something like a hypnotic courier. And allegedly that was actually done during the Second World War. There is a psychologist, Esther Brooks, who claimed that he had actually produced hypnotic couriers. And those are couriers who are given a message and then hypnotized to forget that they were given the message. And then there's some trigger, and then they are able to repeat that message. So they are not consciously aware of it. And that would mean if they got caught by the enemy and they would be interrogated or tortured, they would not be able to give up those secrets. And obviously, there's also an application in terms of assassinations. So the CIA was looking into conducting assassinations, including assassinations of foreign leaders during the 1950s and early 1960s. That is documented, at least 4 major cases. And there was a project Artichoke, which is the predecessor project to MKUltra, which was focused on creating Manchurian candidates. So obviously, we do not know for sure whether they actually accomplished that. So we have some documents that indicate and that they experimented on people and that they were successful. So there was one example that you can find of a secretary who got hypnotized to take a revolver out of a drawer and then shoot a person on command. And she was not aware of that instruction, and she was given the trigger, and she actually performed the action, and obviously the revolver was not loaded. So it seems to be possible that some people can be hypnotized and can be made to perform actions that they would not otherwise perform. So it does not appear that everybody can be hypnotized. So it seems that at least something like a third of the population can be hypnotized to do things that are out of the ordinary. And yeah, 1/3 or less of the population is not susceptible to hypnosis. So I think it depends very much on the person. And they were trying to combine that with drugs. And later on, they were also trying to combine that with electromagnetic waves and audio-visual kind of stimulation. So there is fascinating research that was done during the MK Ultra period. And obviously, the later argument made by the CIA is that none of that actually worked. So they spent 19 or 20 years developing those techniques, and nothing came out of it, which is really hard to believe. So I would agree that most likely the research continued. It is a black project, probably a series of different black projects that are very well hidden in the government. And we just don't know about it. So there are lots of people who claim that they are involuntary subjects of mind control experimentation. So it's actually a pretty large number of people who seem to be affected by that. And it's not just happening in the United States, but worldwide.
Are you familiar with the Extreme Abuse Survey?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
It was carried out by 2 Americans and 2 German researchers. And they had a questionnaire that asked people about different types of abuse they endured. And a number of people said that they'd been through government-controlled mind control. And it's very interesting because there's an age breakdown in the Extreme Abuse Survey, and a number of the respondents say that they were given mind control after the cessation of the programs in 1972. And I've been approached by a number of people because of the writing that I do who allege that they are mind control victims. And with some of them, it's difficult to know, were they made crazy by the CIA or were they just kind of crazy? But I believe a number of them. I really do. I might be naive, but I certainly believe a number of them.
Yeah, that's also my impression, that there is something to it. I mean, it's quite irresistible for a government to have such kind of technology available in order to control people and potentially even control society at large. So I clearly see that there's a huge interest by governments to develop technologies for mind control. And it would be hard to believe that they wouldn't try to do it.
You brought out a fact that I was unaware of. I know that the CIA was getting LSD from Sandoz laboratories, but I did not know that the CIA placed an order for 10 kilograms of LSD with Sandoz. That's equivalent to giving, that's like 100 million trips. And this is 1950. So the CIA could have gotten the majority of Americans to trip had they used it. And I was aware of Sandoz providing, and I also know that the CIA stole the recipe for LSD from Sandoz and started making it in the United States. So apparently the CIA found it to be quite useful for some.
I think that LSD was not very well understood. It was developed by Albert Hofmann in 1938, and it was only discovered as a potential drug for interrogation or mind control in the late 1940s, because it was thought that if you can have a drug that causes psychotic behavior, then you can potentially develop a drug that can reverse that. So there were therapeutic applications for that, but also you could use the same drug for, in terms of warfare to attack another population. And what was very attractive about LSD was that it is very effective in tiny quantities. So you could potentially put it into the water supply of an enemy nation and drive the whole population crazy. So that was the reason why the CIA got interested. So also the army was interested. They were working on a concept that was called psychochemical warfare in the early 1950s. So that was the idea of using incapacitating chemicals against another population in order to facilitate conquest. So you can subdue a population and you can cause chaos in an enemy nation during wartime. So there were many different motivations behind it. And I think the CIA didn't understand what kind of quantities were effective, and it was potentially a mistake that they ordered so much of it. What is interesting is that the army was working on a chemical agent much more potent than LSD, and that was called BZ. And I believe BZ is something like even 100 times more potent than LSD. And the army was stockpiling that agent in the 1950s, and I think into the 1960s, and they had enough BZ to drive the whole world population crazy.
And it's Bizet. I'd never heard of that. I majored in philosophy and hallucinogens in college, but I'd never heard of Bizet. Wow. Because LSD is very powerful.
Yes, it's much more powerful than LSD. And it's a similar chemical compound.
And do you know what happened to all that Bizet?
Well, I think it was destroyed. In 1969, Nixon ordered the destruction of all the chemical and biological weapons. So they would no longer have it. But they were stockpiling chemical and biological agents until the late 1960s.
You get into the basic industry of neuroscience, and you pull out a quote or a figure from James Giordano. And he estimated that in 2013, the global market for neuroscience was $150 billion annually. So if in 2013, if countries are spending $150 billion on neuroscience, they're spending probably much more at this point.
Well, it's very difficult to clearly define what is all included in neuroscience, because it also intersects with other kinds of technologies, such as nanotechnology and artificial intelligence. There are lots of pharmaceutical applications of that as well. So it intersects with healthcare. And there is also a smaller segment that deals with military applications. So it can be probably very difficult to estimate how much money is actually spent on that. But obviously the big thing is brain research. So trying to understand how the brain functions in view of manipulating the brain in a much more targeted manner. And that can have medical applications, but it can also be abused for other things, most importantly, military applications.
You discuss President Obama allocating $4.5 billion to the BRAIN Initiative. And the project is led by the NIH and FDA and DARPA, which DARPA is a scary organization. I find DARPA to be as scary as the CIA and the IRS. And I came across this in the 1970s. DARPA developed a gun that could focus sound waves so the person wouldn't be able to hear exactly what was going on, but it would basically translate as voices in their head. And and you write in your book, since 2002, DARPA has shown interest in biotechnologies and is currently funding a range of neuroscience-related projects. And one of the things that they're shooting for is metabolic dominance. And that is to keep soldiers at peak performance levels, create robotic prostheses, and also treat PTSD and then deep brain stimulation for cognitive augmentation. That's quite a number of things that DARPA is working on.
Well, obviously, we only know about the neuroscientific enhancement projects. So they don't want to talk much about the degradation type technologies that they are also developing. So what they want to openly develop is a super soldier. So you can improve soldier performance through a variety of means, and that also includes neuroscientific improvement. So you can make people operate at peak performance for an extended period of time. So you can reduce the need for sleep. You can have soldiers who remain concentrated for a longer period of time, even if they're experiencing duress. And that can improve their decision-making and also the speed of response. So that can be very important in warfare as well. And that can include various kinds of drugs. It also includes various kinds of sensors that they could implant into soldiers. So these are biosensors, even nanoscale sensors that can monitor the brain function and potentially even to intervene in brain function. So you could reduce pain, you can reduce anxiety, you can potentially change their aggressiveness. So that can also make the soldier perform better in battle. And obviously there are huge medical risks associated with that, and also ethical risks.
And you talk about brain-computer interfaces also.
Yeah, that is very important. So that is definitely something they want to have. There are many different applications for brain-computer interfaces, and I'm sure that will also affect the general population. So it will leak out to the general population. And yeah, there could be positive applications for that, but also very scary applications for that. So it affects mental privacy. So your thoughts are no longer your own. You cannot keep your thoughts private or your mental states private. And that is a problem for society.
And you also get into, DARPA is also looking into genetic selection and enhancement.
Yeah, absolutely. So biotechnology is also very big in terms of future warfare. And there are allegations that the Chinese are already doing it, genetically modifying their soldiers. So they might be doing gene doping. So they can activate or inactivate certain genes. And that can also improve their physical performance and potentially affect also their mental performance. So yeah, I believe that biotechnology will play an important role in the future.
It's interesting when you get into PTSD. My uncle was in the Vietnam Vets Motorcycle Club, and it was a motorcycle club that was started by Vietnam vets, but they would welcome any veterans. And my uncle told me that there are guys that have done 3 or 4 tours in Iraq or Afghanistan. They just keep recycling them. And they joined the motorcycle club. And my uncle said that they can be very, very scary because they are taught what PTSD looks like. So they can shield themselves from looking like they have PTSD. And my uncle said when it comes out like Mount Vesuvius. It just explodes. So I can see why the government would want to somehow be able to control PTSD, although that would be quite a task. And the Pentagon had a study, Emerging Cognitive Neuroscience, and it was published in 2008. And it's worried that Russia, China, and Iran are going to develop neural weapons that are beyond us, which I find kind of amazing, because the Pentagon said that the Soviets were keeping up in the arms race with us when we were way ahead of them. And we started the mind control programs because we thought the Soviets were way ahead of us in that area too, but it proved that we were ahead of them, or certainly stride by stride with them. So this seems to be a new weapons race.
Well, it's very hard to say who is actually leading in this new type of arms race. I mean, there is a good argument to be made that Russia was indeed leading in the area of so-called psychotronic weapons. So they have a very long history of unorthodox physical and biological research, and they understand the electromagnetic dimension of the human body much better than we understand it in the West. So there is the argument that they were indeed ahead of us in terms of developing directed energy weapons that could affect mental function, and that could be used for even manipulating behavior as well. So there was the case of the Moscow signal in the 1960s and 1970s. I think it was actually already discovered in 1953, around that time, early 1950s. And it was only becoming public after 1972. So the allegation was that the Soviets were bombarding the American embassy with microwaves, and they were doing it to affect the behavior and health of the people inside. And that resulted in the US government also looking into the possibility of using directed energy in that manner. And that was a DARPA project, which was called Pandora, from 1965 to 1970, where they were trying to figure out, is it possible or is it not possible? And officially, the findings of Pandora were inconclusive. So they were saying that actually we can't affect the mental states or the health of people using low-powered microwaves. And yet that is still the position we have in the West in terms of the scientific understanding of electromagnetic fields and how they interact with the human body. In the West, we tend to believe that there is very little effect. And in other countries, in particular in Russia and China, I think there is a better understanding of those kinds of effects. So they have a different kind of science.
In the third chapter of your book, you get into how neuroscience can be used for gathering intelligence. And you've got 4 different categories: strategic intelligence, intelligence analysis and decision-making, threat detection, and neuroscience and interrogation. Could you expound upon that?
Well, you can use it for prediction as well. So what you can do is understand societies better. So there's something called cultural neuroscience. So there are different, people behave differently in different cultures, and neuroscience can potentially account for that. And that can help us in terms of strategic intelligence, understanding also the decisions of foreign leaders, and also understanding the behavior of societies at large. So that deals with societal dynamics. So we can potentially predict that. And we can also use it at a more individual level for interrogation. So you can determine whether somebody is telling the truth or not. And you can monitor their responses, and you can potentially track people using certain brainwave patterns. So you can use it for surveillance purposes as well. You can use it for threat detection. So whether somebody has a hostile intent or not. And you can generally use it for even predicting individual behavior. So there are many different applications for that.
Could you tell us how neuroscience, how we would understand the decision-making process of foreign leaders? How would neuroscience help us with that?
Well, you can develop a psychological profile of a leader. So that has been done at least since the Second World War. So US intelligence was developing a psychological profile of Adolf Hitler. And obviously we can do it now in a much more sophisticated manner because we better understand human behavior and the human brain. So it also depends on collecting information, data points on people. So the more data points you have, the more likely it is that your prediction is going to be accurate. And yeah, you can monitor the behavior of people in a huge amount of detail. So you can use video images and detect any kind of responses to stimuli. So for example, if you present a person with a certain stimulus, you can see how they respond emotionally to it. You can potentially even monitor the brainwaves of people, including foreign leaders. And you could potentially monitor their emotional states.
And when we get into neuroscience and interrogation, you write, it is argued that strategic intelligence can be improved through cultural neuroscience that explores the differences in the way people from foreign cultures process information and how their values shape their actions. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, there's the argument that there are different human civilizations and different cultures, and people think differently because they use different languages, and they also have different cognitive habits. So there are different ways people of different cultures process information and understand information. So that is not universal across all human beings. So if we can account for those differences, we can better understand what motivates people of a different culture. So we as Westerners think often in terms of a universal human nature. And I don't think that is quite accurate. And we are underestimating the importance of cultural differences. And I think neuroscience can give us certain insights about that. So also in terms of the different value structures. People of different cultures have different sets of values, and that shapes their perception of the world and also to a great extent their behavior. And we often don't understand it, why people in other cultures behave differently than we do.
And you say intelligence analysis could be improved by enhancing intelligence analysts or by using neurocyber systems that utilize and replicate human pattern recognition ability. So basically what you're saying there is we can use neuroscience to enhance the abilities of intelligence analysts.
I think that's an IARPA project. So there's an intelligence community equivalent of DARPA. So that's the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency. And I think they had something like 3 or 4 different projects at the time when I was writing the book that were dealing with how to improve the cognitive abilities of intelligence analysts. So they were thinking about things like brain-computer interfaces, so monitoring the brains of the analysts and potentially also flagging certain information. And they were, thinking about general neuroscientific enhancement, so improve the brains of the analysts to develop better analysis. And the use of the combination of artificial intelligence and human intelligence. So how the analysts could better leverage artificial intelligence for their analysis.
And you also talk about neuroscience being used from deception detection to mind reading. And now I know that there was an MK Ultra project, I think it was 136, that was looking into psychic abilities, but then there was Stargate, which was basically, it was called remote viewing, but in essence, it was psychic abilities. And the government underwrote Stargate for 22 or 23 years, and then it said it didn't work. And I'm pretty sure we talked about it earlier. Why would you spend money on something for 22 or 23 years that didn't work? So my belief is that Stargate went black. And that there is some kind of ability to teach people, or some people just have an innate ability for mind reading. Or I think the bottom line is some people just get more radio stations than others. And I also believe that this can be honed. I believe that people have psychic abilities just because of what I said, that some people get more radio stations than others. But I don't know if it can be just summoned at will. I kind of have a tendency to believe that people that have those abilities, it comes to them when it comes to them, that they just can't immediately summon it. Just my thoughts on psychic abilities.
Well, paranormal research, or parapsychology as it's called, and that kind of research goes back to the late 19th century, and it was quite popular in Russia. And I think it's still quite popular in Russia, this idea that some people have psychic abilities and they can potentially do psychokinesis and telepathy and things like that. And there was a lot of research done also in the United States. The period when it was popular was the 1970s, which is interesting because they were just closing down MK Ultra in 72. And in 73, they were conducting all those kinds of parapsychology experiments, which was also funded by the CIA at the Stanford Research Institute. And that led to what you described, the remote viewing programs. They were shut down in 1995 after they were conducting some assessment of the performance of the remote viewers, and they concluded that it didn't produce any tangible results. But obviously those results were questioned. So there are people associated with that program who said that the conclusions of the assessment were nonsense, and that the remote viewing program was very successful in terms of having the remote viewers describe foreign or distant locations very accurately. So they were using it for intelligence collection. So that was the official version of it. I'm not quite sure what to make of the remote viewing programs. So it's a very fascinating story. But I'm just questioning whether this was the actual purpose of it or whether there was some other kind of experimentation going on in terms of mind reading using technological means rather than just having a medium and doing some paranormal stuff. So as far as I know, there's very limited evidence that there are psychic abilities. So there's something else must have been going on with that project. That's my take.
Is it possible that the government would fund something for over 2 decades that showed no promise or possibility whatsoever.
Well, they were certainly doing something. And one theory is that the remote viewers were actually test subjects themselves. So they were trying to develop something that was later called synthetic telepathy. So they may have found a way of transmitting mental processes or thoughts from one person to another person using radio waves or extremely low frequency waves. So that is one theory. And if you look at some of the people who were developing that, so in particular, Russell Tark and
Al Puthoff.
They had a different kind of background related to physics and microwave kind of stuff. And so it is a strange thing that they got so interested in that kind of parapsychology research.
Targ's father ran an occult bookstore in Chicago, and that could have been the genesis of his interest in the paranormal. And in the fourth chapter, you look at chemical and biochemical weapons as they relate to neurowarfare. And you divide them into different categories, like calmatives. Tell us about how calmatives could be used for neurowarfare.
Well, obviously, it's an incapacitating agent. So you could use it against adversaries in order to degrade their ability to fight or their willingness to fight. So the idea was to put them asleep or reduce their capacity. So you could do it in the context of counterterrorism type of operations. So if you have a hostage-taking situation where you have terrorists in a theater, so that was the Moscow theater terror attack that happened in 2002, and you could release a gas or some other form into that theater, and that would put everybody asleep, and then you could capture the terrorists without actually having to kill anybody and saving the hostages. And so that is a potential application of calmatives. You could also direct it against enemy troops, so you could avoid having to kill people, and that could be something positive. But the problem is that you have, with all chemical agents, the dose response issue. So you cannot control the exact dose that everybody receives. So some people will receive a very high dose and some people will receive a very low dose. And the effects could be radically different from no effect to lethal effect. So that is a general issue with any kind of non-lethal chemical agents.
And you also talk about hypnosis-inducing drugs that theoretically make it possible to make someone highly susceptible to being hypnotized or suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, that was a major part of MKUltra research. So they were trying to combine drugs with hypnosis, and because they were thinking that hypnosis is a very powerful tool, but it doesn't work on everybody, and it takes some effort to hypnotize somebody. So if you had a drug that could hypnotize a person much more quickly, then it might have a wider range of applications. And yeah, that's the reason why they were looking into very kinds of hallucinogenic drugs, among them LSD, but also scopolamine and mescaline, and yeah, various. I think they were looking at over 100 different types of chemicals that they could be potentially used for interrogation. So it was a very large-scale research project, and that was part of the MKUltra research.
Scopolamine is, I think it's been used for hypnosis, or it's been an effective drug for hypnosis.
Yeah, it is said that it makes people very suggestible. Some people say that this is the original zombie drug. I mean, there is the legend that in Haiti they have some powder that they spray into the face of people, and then they become zombies. Yeah, in Latin America, I think they call it burundanga. And there are many stories of people who have been exposed to scopolamine, and then they have been talked into taking a stranger to their apartment. And the stranger was then emptying the apartment while the person was just looking and was not able to do anything about it. And then it affects the memory. So they can't even remember what happened to them. So it's a very interesting kind of drug. And I think it's still being used for motion sickness. So that is interesting as well. And there are stories that some of the terrorists rendered by the CIA had been given scopolamine, supposedly to cure motion sickness while they were in an aircraft or something like that. But I could imagine that it has some utility for interrogation.
And is that natural, or is that made in a laboratory?
I think it's an alkaloid kind of compound. So it's a natural thing.
And you've gone to surmise about the different types of agents that will be used for mind control or brain control, CNS manipulation. What do you think is on the docket or in the queue as far as those type of agents go?
But I think chemicals are no longer the most exciting thing in terms of brain manipulation. I think we've gone beyond that. Pharmacology, I think, has reached its limits. We are probably looking at much more sophisticated ways of manipulating the brain than just drugs. I mean, drugs are very difficult to control in terms of the effects. I mean, that is the general problem with using things like LSD. It has very unpredictable results. It works differently on different people. And even in terms of the scopolamine, it might not work the way you predicted. So sometimes people can become much calmer. Sometimes they might become aggressive. So that is a general issue with chemicals and drugs. So that's the reason why I think the research in MKUltra shifted more towards electromagnetic type of approaches. So they were using radio waves and microwaves and see how those kind of affect the brain function. And now we have much more sophisticated ways. It's optogenetics is one of them. So use light to stimulate neurons. And yeah, you could use nanotechnology, nanobots inserted into the bloodstream and that go into the brain. And you could combine it with microwaves in order to stimulate certain brain areas. So I think there are much more sophisticated and better ways than drugs these days.
Some people say that nanobots are with us right now. What do you think? Do you think that they're a reality, or do you think that DARPA or some ominous organization is still working on nanobots?
But I think nanotechnology has become much more sophisticated. I mean, it started out as a branch of chemistry, but now it is moving more in the direction of biology. So we have self-assembling structures. So nanotechnology is manipulation of matter below 100 nanometers. So that these are it's larger than molecules, but it is still smaller than biological cells, for example. So for example, viruses If you manipulate those, you would be using nanotechnology. And yeah, it would be a combination of biology and chemistry. And I think they're already using it. So the COVID vaccine that is using mRNA, it is incorporating nanotechnology because it's manipulating matter on a very small scale, and it is changing cell function. So it is inserting information into a human cell in order to produce the spike protein, and you can describe it as nanotechnology. So it is, in a sense, self-assembling kind of thing.
So the spike protein, it goes through the cell wall and into the cell. And you would call that nanotechnology. That's interesting. In the 5th chapter of your book, you talk about non-lethal directed energy weapons. Could you give us an overview of that?
Well, you can use the electromagnetic spectrum, or you can use acoustic type of weapons. So there are different kinds of technologies that are being used. We have some well-known acoustic weapons. So the LRAD, long-range acoustic device. So it is a directional sound, and that is very loud. So you can use it, I think, at least 1 kilometer. So it's quite some distance, and it can, affect people because of the noise. And then you have also something called millimeter waves. So that is the active denial system, which was developed during the 1990s, I think, by the Air Force. And it causes a burning sensation on the skin if people are exposed to it, and it has a range of several hundred meters. It was deployed in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Allegedly, it was never used, but you can use it in theory for dispersing crowds. So if you have a mob in front of you, you can just radiate them with the active denial system, and they would be running away because they were feeling the pain. There are other kinds of things that they have been looking at as well. So high-powered microwaves, which is more antimaterial, but potentially you could also turn it into an anti-personnel weapon.
The second technology you talked about, that causes the burning of the skin.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that. That's kind of intriguing to me.
Well, I think it uses...
How is it generated?
Well, it produces terahertz. So it's above the microwave spectrum.
Okay.
And it's called millimeter waves. So it was very big at the time when it was developed. So it requires to cool the electronics to an extremely low temperature. And the problem was that it took several hours to prepare the weapon to be used. And that was one of the reasons why they allegedly never used it. But there's also a smaller version that was developed, so that fits on a Humvee. So it has some sort of how to describe it, some antenna that can be directed at people. So there's a smaller version as well.
And people's skin, they just start feeling. Does it burn the skin? It must burn the skin.
Allegedly, it doesn't penetrate the skin, so it only creates a burning sensation. And it depends also on the exposure time. I think they only tested it for a couple of seconds on people. If you expose people for a longer time period, I could imagine that it would cause skin damage. And it could also affect the eyes. So if people would be looking directly into it, I could imagine that the eyes could be damaged by that kind of technology. So there are huge ethical issues with using things like the active denial system.
Unfortunately, the military often isn't governed by ethics, which is one of the problems. When earlier you talked about microwaves, that the Russians might have been putting directing microwaves towards the U.S. embassy. With Havana Syndrome, would you say that that is microwave technology, or what are your thoughts about Havana Syndrome?
Well, I think Havana Syndrome is real. I mean, it was first reported in in summer 2017, but they said there were cases in late 2016. So it affected American diplomats in Cuba first, but also some Canadian diplomats. And later it was also found in various other kinds of locations, in particular in China and in Russia. And I think also in Austria, that was one of the hotspots for Havana Syndrome. People experience something like a traumatic brain injury, but it is not a typical concussion. And they also experience vertigo, nausea, and it can affect their sleep and their well-being. So there are different kinds of symptoms that are associated with Havana Syndrome. And it seems to be consistent with pulsed microwave weapons. So that is one of the theories as to what produces Havana Syndrome. And it seems to be a much more sophisticated type of weapon than was used in the 1960s and 1970s on the American diplomats in Moscow. So that is my take. I think Havana Syndrome is real, and that there are people who were attacked by a directed energy weapon.
And that weapon would be fine-tuned microwaves?
Pulsed microwave energy. So that is one of the theories.
With a different sine and cosine, just very different compared to its predecessors?
It can produce much more severe effects. With respect to the Moscow signal, the main concern was that it was causing cancer. And people inside of the embassy were also not feeling well, but that can be subjective. But with Havana Syndrome, there are at least some cases where there's a diagnosis of traumatic brain injury. So it can be shown that people have been exposed to something that is looking like a concussion, but not quite. And in one theory is pulsed microwaves. So they found a way of actually causing real damage to the brain and producing more immediate effects. So there's a sudden onset to the Havana Syndrome. So people notice it when they get attacked. It's not something like I have a headache and it was a little bit light and then got a little bit stronger. And no, people feel it when they get attacked, and pretty instantly.
And you talk about these weapons being interstate weapons. You talk about controlling large populations in the face of mass impoverishment and civil unrest and environmental disaster. So basically what you're saying is that some of these weapon systems that we're talking about could easily be projected onto a government's population to control the population.
I think that's the most logical kind of usage for those kinds of weapons. So So I'm very concerned about this possibility that governments can abuse the technology for purposes of subjugation of their population. And yeah, I think we are already under massive psychological attack. And that is just another escalation of it. So we are already manipulated to a high extent. I think the governments are running psychological operations against their own populations. And yeah, it could get much worse with those kinds of weapons.
I've brought this up on my podcast before. Michael Aquino and John Alexander wrote a paper called From PSYOP to Mind War. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, sure.
But they posit that the warring state's population has to be more or less brainwashed into believing in the war. So there isn't demonstrations like what's happened previously. So basically what they're saying is you need to brainwash your own population, and that'll cause, so that they won't cause any problems where you wage war.
And I think the paper was written like early 80s, 1980s,
Yes.
something like that. And the US was just coming out of the Vietnam War. And the argument with the Vietnam War was that it was lost on the home front. So because Americans were not supporting the war enough after 68, the US lost the war in Vietnam. So if we had the possibility of changing the perception of the population and preventing them from getting together and protesting against the war, then the US would have been able to win the war in Vietnam. So that's my reading of that paper. And that it's trying to use psychological warfare writ large. And psychological warfare is always directed against the enemy, but also to some extent directed against the own population in order to sustain the will for the fight and to prevent the enemy from demoralizing the own population. So that's nothing really unusual.
And this is a quote from your book. The concept of neurowarfare proposes instead that other societies could be subverted and assimilated through sophisticated attacks on a collective consciousness. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, there is the argument that the Soviets were trying to do that with Western nations and also the United States. So there's a discussion about a concept called ideological subversion. You're probably familiar with the Yuri Bezmenov interview. So he was suggesting that the Soviets were trying to change the value system and culture in the West in order to make them more susceptible to communist ideology and to change the whole context of the Cold War in a manner where Americans no longer find it to their disadvantage to merge with the Soviet Union, essentially. I think that is quite possible that there was such an effort to subvert Western societies on a massive scale and to use it for changing the whole direction of those societies.
And you think that oh, go ahead.
Yeah, according to the designs of the Soviet Union.
And you think that the United States used that type of strategy against the Soviet Union?
Well, that's quite possible. I mean, the CIA learned from what the Soviets were doing, and I think they were quite successful in dismantling the Soviet bloc in the late 1980s with the color revolutions.
Yes.
So there was a series of peaceful revolutions, and that was clearly sponsored to some extent by the CIA. So there's the famous case with Solidarność in Poland. So that was not started by the CIA, but it was supported by the CIA. And they had similar efforts in other Soviet bloc countries. So they were trying to ideologically undermine the Soviet bloc. And ultimately, the CIA was successful in doing that.
George Soros underwrote much of that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Transhumanists like Ray Kurzweil, they talk about basically the brain as little more than a biocomputer, like psychocybernetics. And you talk about with the brain, there's a certain plasticity that makes it much more difficult to capture than just it being a regular biocomputer. Could you tell us about that?
Well, it's a philosophical question as to what the self is. And the argument of the neuroscientists is that everything we are is the brain. So the brain creates the illusion of a self, and that there is really no free will. So everything that we do is processed and caused by the brain. So if we could manipulate the brain in a certain manner, then we could change people. And so we could change the personality of people, and we could change their behavior, and that could be for the good of society. So that is the transhumanist argument, and it gets even crazier with the idea of uploading the mind into a computer so that people could live forever. And that would be kind of the technological paradise. But I don't think that is quite the truth. So if you accept that there is more than a brain, and then you get into the debate of the soul, so that there is something that remains of the human personality and the self that is not captured in the brain and brain processes.
A number of people think that the brain is certainly a biological neurochemical, but the mind is out here. And there's Kirlian photography. Are you familiar with Kirlian photography?
Yes, the aura.
Yes, that's able to, and it's interesting because people that are on different types of drugs have different types of auras, and people that have different types of lifestyles have different auras, as seen through Kirlian photography. So I think that kind of is an indication that the mind might be way beyond the brain.
Well, I mean, there are stories of people who have died and came back, and they were technically dead in terms of their brain stopped working. And they're saying that they were still aware and that they could move around, that they have memory of what happened around them when they were dead. So that is quite remarkable, and it would indicate that there's more to us than just a brain.
The University of Virginia Department of Perceptual Studies has a number of those out-of-body experiences where people they describe things that they couldn't have possibly have known about because they were in a coma, which is kind of interesting. Like one woman said that there was a shoe on the roof of the hospital, and it turned out to be that there was a shoe on the roof of the hospital. Fascinating stuff. Armin, I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And have yourself a great night.
Yep, you too.